Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid and mine. With those words, a poor English shoemaker was publicly humiliated and his dream dismissed. But what the world saw as an ending was actually the beginning of a story that would reshape a nation and spark a global movement that continues to this day. But have you ever felt that same thing? Have you ever had a dream in your heart? A calling you felt was from God, only to be told it was impossible? This man had no money, no influence, and no formal education. So how did he overcome it all? The secret is found in a simple, powerful two-part phrase he spoke just moments before he was silenced. A phrase that holds the key to unlocking any great purpose. And tonight, as we journey through his incredible life, you will discover it too. So, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let us begin the story of a man who expected great things and attempted them for God. In a quiet English village, a young cobbler sits at his bench. The smell of leather and wax fills the small workshop, but as his hands shape a simple shoe, his mind is thousands of miles away. Chapter 1. The Cobbler's Globe. In a quiet English village, a young cobbler sits at his bench. The smell of leather and wax fills the small workshop, but as his hands shape a simple shoe, his mind is thousands of miles away, tracing the coastlines of continents he has only ever seen in his dreams. This humble room, filled with the tools of a simple trade, held a vision as wide as the world itself. The story of William Carey begins not with a grand declaration from a pulpit, but in the gentle, rolling countryside of Northamptonshire. He was born in the middle of the 1700s in the peaceful village of Polisbury, a place where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons. His father was a weaver, a man whose hands, like his own, knew the quiet dignity of patient work. The world around young William was small and knowable. It was a patchwork of green fields, ancient stone churches, and neighbors who had known his family for generations. From his earliest days, he was a boy marked by a deep and insatiable curiosity. While other children played games, William could be found exploring the hedgerows, his pockets filled with flowers, insects, and bird feathers. He saw the world not as a simple backdrop, but as a living museum, each leaf and every creature a testament to the boundless imagination of its creator. His childhood room was a collection of natural wonders, a tangible library of God's handiwork. He saw in the intricate design of a beetle's wing the same genius that placed the stars in the heavens. This was the first language he learned to read, the language of creation, and it filled him with a quiet sense of awe that would shape the rest of his life. As a young man, he was expected to work outdoors, to follow his father into a trade that relied on the strength of his hands in the open air. But God, in his infinite and often mysterious wisdom, had a different path planned. A painful affliction of the skin made it impossible for William to endure the sun and the heat of the fields. What might have seemed like a cruel limitation, a closing of a door, was in fact a moment of divine redirection. This physical trial gently guided him away from the plow and toward a different kind of labor. At the age of 14, he was apprenticed to a shoemaker in a nearby village. He was moved indoors into the quiet, sheltered world of a cobbler's workshop. Here, protected from the sun, another kind of seed could be planted in the fertile soil of his mind. The workshop became his sanctuary, his school, and his seminary. The hours were long and the work was repetitive, but his mind was free to wander, to question, and to learn. While his hands were busy cutting leather, stitching seams, and hammering soles, his spirit was journeying to ancient lands through the pages of borrowed books. In that small, dusty room, an astonishing gift began to surface. William Carey discovered he had a profound, God-given aptitude for languages. With no formal education beyond the village school, he began to teach himself with a diligence that was nothing short of remarkable. A copy of a New Testament in Latin became his first great challenge. He methodically, patiently unlocked its secrets, word by word, until the language of the ancient Romans became as familiar to him as his own. But this was only the beginning. His spiritual heart had been awakened, and he felt a deep, abiding love for the scriptures. This love fueled an even deeper hunger to understand the Bible in its original tongues. He found a way to acquire a Greek grammar and lexicon, and soon he was reading the Gospels as they were first written, feeling the weight and texture of every word. He did not stop there. The Old Testament beckoned, and so he sought out a Jewish friend in a nearby town to help him unravel the beautiful, complex characters of Hebrew. His master, the old shoemaker, would often find him at his bench late into the night, a piece of leather in one hand and a Greek text propped open in the other. It was a picture of a life divided between two callings: the earthly work that provided his daily bread and the heavenly work that fed his soul. This was not the education of a university with learned professors and vast libraries. This was the quiet, determined education of a humble man, empowered by the Spirit of God, who was being prepared for a purpose he could not yet imagine. Each new word he learned was a small step on a journey that would eventually cross oceans. As his knowledge grew, so did his awareness of the world beyond his small English village. He began to read accounts from sailors and explorers, men who had sailed to the far corners of the earth. He read the journals of Captain Cook, and the descriptions of faraway islands and vast continents ignited his imagination. He learned of peoples and cultures who had never seen a Bible, who had never heard the name of the God who had so captivated his own heart. A great and heavy burden began to settle upon him. It was a holy discontent, a sense that the grace he had received was not meant for him alone. He began to see the world not as a collection of territories on a map, but as a vast field of souls, each one precious to God. He felt a growing conviction that the command to go into all the world and preach the gospel was not a historical suggestion, but a living, breathing mandate for his own time, for his own life. This global vision needed a form, a way to be held and contemplated. And so, in the middle of his humble workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, William Carey created something extraordinary. Using his skill with leather, he began to craft a globe of the world. He stitched together scraps of shoe leather, carefully shaping them into a sphere. With painstaking detail, he drew the continents, the oceans, and the islands, painting them onto the leather with simple inks. This globe was more than a masterpiece of homespun cartography. It was a tool for prayer. It became the focal point of his devotion. Late at night, when the village was asleep and the only sound was the gentle ticking of a clock, William would sit before his leather world. He would place a finger on India, on China, on the islands of the southern seas, and he would pray. He prayed for the millions of people who lived in those lands, people whose faces he had never seen, but whose souls he yearned for. He would gather what little information he could find about their cultures and their beliefs, and he would present them by name before the throne of grace. The cobbler's workshop had become a prayer room for the nations. His simple bench had become an altar, and the work of his hands had created a tangible symbol of the burden God had placed upon his heart. He was still just a poor, unknown shoemaker in a forgotten corner of England, but in that quiet room, a fire had been kindled. It was a fire of love for a lost world, a fire that would one day light up the darkness on the other side of the earth. This was the beginning of his journey. It was a slow, quiet, and hidden preparation, far from the eyes of the world. It was a time of learning, of praying, and of waiting on the Lord. The hands that were learning to master the craft of making shoes were the same hands that were being prepared to carry the word of God to a distant land. The mind that was memorizing Greek verbs was the same mind that was being sharpened to translate the eternal truths of Scripture into the languages of millions. God was at work in the silence, shaping a willing heart, forging a humble vessel for a great and glorious purpose. The world did not know his name, but heaven was already recording his prayers. The globe sat on his workbench, a constant, silent reminder of the vastness of the world and the even greater vastness of God's love for it. Every stitch in the leather was a prayer, every painted coastline a plea. A great vision had been born in the heart of a simple man, a vision that would soon ask him to question everything he had ever known. Chapter 2. The Spark of Inquiry. A single question, once it takes root in a prepared heart, can change the course of a life. For William Carey, that question was not shouted in a moment of crisis, but whispered from the pages of a sea captain's journal, a quiet spark that would grow into an unquenchable fire. The prayers offered over the leather globe were not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a transformation. As William's hands continued their daily labor, his spirit was being drawn ever deeper into a life of faith. He had grown up in the Church of England, the established church of the land, but his heart longed for a more personal and deeply committed expression of his beliefs. He found a spiritual home among a small group of dissenters, Christians who met outside the formal structures of the state church. It was here, in the warmth of close fellowship and the earnest study of Scripture, that his faith solidified. He was baptized by immersion in the river Nene, a public declaration of his personal commitment to follow Christ. Soon after, this young man with a passion for God's word was asked to become a pastor. It was not a grand appointment. The congregation was small and impoverished, unable to offer him a living wage, and so his life fell into a demanding but holy rhythm. By day, he was a shoemaker, his hands calloused from the familiar work with leather and thread. By night, and in every spare moment, he was a shepherd to his small flock, a student of the eternal truths, poring over his books by candlelight to prepare sermons that would nourish and encourage the handful of souls entrusted to his care. His life was a testament to quiet faithfulness, a living example of serving God in the midst of ordinary, everyday work. It was during this time that a book fell into his hands that would alter the trajectory of his life. It was a copy of the voyages of Captain James Cook, the famed explorer who had charted vast, unknown regions of the Pacific Ocean. As William read, the walls of his small workshop seemed to dissolve. He was transported from the gentle hills of Northamptonshire to the sun-drenched shores of Tahiti, to the coastlines of New Zealand, and to the mysterious lands of the southern hemisphere. Captain Cook's prose was that of a scientist and a sailor, filled with detailed observations of the peoples, the plants, the animals, and the customs he encountered. For a man with William's boundless curiosity, it was utterly captivating. He read of cultures and societies so completely different from his own, yet filled with people who, he knew, were crafted in the very same image of God. He saw them not as savages or curiosities, but as distant relatives in the human family, living and dying without ever hearing the story that had become the anchor of his own soul. A profound sense of spiritual longing began to well up within him. It was a burden, but not a heavy one. Rather, it was a weight of compassion, a deep and abiding ache for the spiritual state of these millions of souls. The prayers he'd been offering over his leather globe now had faces and names, villages and shores. The abstract burden was becoming a specific, undeniable call. This growing conviction, however, was out of step with the prevailing religious thought of his day. Many churches at the time held to a theological view that made missionary work seem unnecessary, even presumptuous. The belief was that God was sovereign, and if he wished to save people in distant lands, he would certainly do so in his own time and in his own way, without the need for human interference. This was a faith that emphasized waiting on God, but it had, for many, become a reason for inaction. The Great Commission, Christ's command to his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, was widely interpreted as a task given only to the original apostles, a command that had been fulfilled in the 1st century and was no longer binding on the church. To suggest otherwise, to propose that a group of humble English believers should take it upon themselves to evangelize the world, was seen as radical, misguided, and even arrogant. Who were they to think they could assist the Almighty in his work? This was the theological wall that stood before William Carey, but the question sparked by Captain Cook's journals would not let him rest. If God's love was for the whole world, why should the news of that love be confined to only one small part of it? If Christ's sacrifice was sufficient for all, were Christians not obligated to tell everyone? He turned to the scriptures, his ultimate source of truth, and found his conviction affirmed on every page. He saw a God whose heart yearned for the nations, a story of salvation that was universal in its scope. He could find no verse that suggested the Great Commission had expired. Instead, he saw a timeless command, a sacred duty, a glorious privilege. And so, he began to write. He took up his pen, not as an angry rebel, but as a careful, thoughtful inquirer. He began to channel all of his study, all of his prayer, and all of his holy burden onto paper. The result was a small but powerful book with a long and descriptive title, An Enquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. Every word in that title was chosen with deliberate care. The word enquiry signaled his humble approach. He was not delivering a dogmatic decree, but inviting his fellow believers to reason with him from the scriptures. The word obligations was his central, radical claim that this work was not optional, but a binding duty. And the most revolutionary phrase of all was to use means. This was his direct challenge to the passive faith of his day. He was arguing that while salvation is the work of God alone, God has ordained that this work be accomplished through the faithful means of human messengers. Christians were obligated to go, to preach, to translate, and to serve. The book itself was a model of his orderly and methodical mind. It was divided into 5 parts. First, he made the scriptural case that the Great Commission was still in effect. He walked through the Bible, showing that God's missionary purpose was a thread woven from Genesis to Revelation. Second, he gave a brief history of missions, demonstrating that the work had been carried on in fits and starts since the time of the apostles. Third, he presented an exhaustive survey of the state of the world, using his globe and the best geographical data he could find. He went through the world, continent by continent, country by country, listing their populations, their religions, and their spiritual condition. It was a breathtakingly detailed account, a factual report on the vastness of the need. Fourth, he answered the common objections to missions, that the dangers were too great, the expenses too high, the cultural barriers insurmountable. And finally, in the 5th section, he laid out a practical plan. He called for the formation of the society, a voluntary association of believers who would pool their resources to pray for, send out, and support missionaries. This was not a work of abstract theology. It was a roadmap for action, a blueprint for a movement. It was born in a humble pastor study written by the hand of a working shoemaker, but it contained an idea that was destined to reshape the world. Every page was infused with a quiet, confident faith. His conviction was not a loud, fiery passion, but a deep, unshakable peace, a calm assurance that this was the clear and simple will of God. He had heard a question whispered from across the seas, and he had answered it with a clear, logical, and loving call to obedience. The manuscript was finished. A stack of paper, covered in ink, sat on his desk. It was a collection of facts and figures, of scripture and careful reasoning. It held within it the seed of a global spiritual awakening. But for now, it was just a quiet inquiry, waiting for a voice to give it life. Chapter 3. Expect great things. Sometimes the most powerful words, the words that will echo through centuries, are not spoken in a grand cathedral, but in a small, dusty meeting room where faith has grown tired and expectations have grown small. It was in such a place, among a gathering of weary pastors, that a humble shoemaker stood to speak, and with a quiet conviction, he lit a fire that would warm the entire world. The year was 1792. In the city of Nottingham, England, a small assembly of Baptist ministers gathered for their annual association meeting. The mood was not one of vibrant expectation. These were difficult times for nonconformist churches. Their congregations were often small and poor, and the prevailing spiritual climate was one of quiet maintenance rather than bold expansion. The pastors were good, faithful men, dedicated to shepherding their local flocks, but their vision was largely confined to the borders of their own towns and villages. The idea of a global mission was as distant to them as the moon. Into this atmosphere of cautious faith stepped William Carey. He was still a young man, known more for his quiet intensity and his unusual gift for languages than for any great oratorical skill. He was not a commanding presence, but on that day, God had given him a message that would command the attention of generations to come. He rose to speak, opening his Bible to the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 54. The words he read aloud would have been familiar to the ministers gathered before him, a beautiful promise of restoration given to ancient Israel. But Carey, illuminated by the burden God had placed on his heart, saw in them a timeless call to the church of his own day. He read the words with a calm, steady voice. Enlarge the place of your tent, and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes, for you will spread out to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess the nations and will settle the desolate cities. He then began to preach, using the simple, powerful metaphor of the tent. He explained that this tent was the church, the dwelling place of God's people, and the command from God was clear. It was time to grow. It was time to stop being content with a small, familiar space. It was time to pull up the old tent pegs and move into new territory. It was time to lengthen the cords of faith and strengthen the stakes of commitment, because God was about to do something far greater than they could imagine. His sermon was not a burst of raw, untamed emotion. It was a careful, logical, and deeply passionate appeal flowing from the very center of his being. He had spent years praying over his globe, years studying the scriptures, years writing down his reasoned arguments in his inquiry. Now, all of that patient preparation was being poured out in this one pivotal moment. He built his case, piece by piece, leading his listeners to an inescapable conclusion. The God they served was a great God, a global God, whose love was not limited by geography or culture. Therefore, the work of his people could not be small or provincial. Their vision had to be as large as God's heart. And then he distilled his entire message into two simple, powerful, and perfectly balanced points. They were two sides of the same divine coin, a couplet of truth that would become the watchword for the entire modern missionary movement. First, he implored them, expect great things from God. This was the foundation. It was a call to lift their eyes from their own limited resources and their own small congregations, and to fix them upon the infinite power and faithfulness of the Almighty. It was a reminder that the God who parted the Red Sea and raised Christ from the dead was still on his throne, able and willing to do immeasurably more than they could ask or imagine. Faith, he was saying, must begin with a great expectation, a holy confidence in the character of God himself. Then he delivered the second inseparable point: attempt great things for God. This was the necessary response to that great expectation. If they truly believed in a great God, their actions must reflect that belief. Faith was not passive waiting. It was active obedience. It was taking risks. It was stepping out of the boat and onto the water. The attempt was not born of human arrogance or self-reliance, but from a deep and trusting dependence on the God they expected to act. It was a message of beautiful, radical simplicity. The greatness of their attempts was to be a direct reflection of the greatness of their God. When he finished, a profound silence fell over the room. The air was thick with the weight of his words. He had presented them with a vision so large, so daring, that it seemed to overwhelm them. He had called them to lengthen their cords to the very ends of the earth, and they could only see the shortness of their own reach. And then the silence was broken. An older, highly respected minister, a man named John Ryland Sr., rose to his feet. He was not a man of malice, but he was a man of his time, a guardian of the cautious tradition. He looked at the young pastor and spoke the words that would become infamous in the history of missions. "Young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, He will do it without your aid and mine." It was a stunning rebuke, a wall of tradition rising up against the tide of a new and holy idea. The spirit of the age had found its voice, and it was a voice of dismissal. For a moment, it seemed that the fire Carey had so carefully kindled had been extinguished with a single breath. The meeting moved on to other, more practical matters, and William Carey was left with a feeling of profound grief. He was seen turning to his friend, the minister, Andrew Fuller, his eyes filled with tears, pleading with him, "Are we to do nothing?" But the words of God, once spoken through a willing vessel, do not return empty. Though the sermon had been publicly rejected, the seed had been planted in the hearts of a few good men. Andrew Fuller and others like him could not shake the power and truth of what they had heard. Carey's quiet, persistent faith had begun its work. Over the next few months, conversations continued, prayers were offered, and hearts were softened. The Holy Spirit was fanning the fading ember of that sermon back into a flame. And so it was that in October of that same year, in the small town of Kettering, another meeting took place. This time, it was not in a public hall, but in the back parlor of a widow's home. It was a small group of just 12 Baptist ministers, the ones who had been truly stirred by the call to expect and attempt great things. There, in the quiet intimacy of that small room, they made a world-changing resolution. They voted to form a society, which they named the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel amongst the Heathen. The modern missionary movement was born. The grandeur of their resolution was immediately contrasted by the humility of their resources. After the motion was passed, a collection was taken to begin this monumental work of global evangelization. Andrew Fuller passed around his own personal snuff box as an offering plate. When the collection was counted, the total sum for launching this great enterprise was a mere £13, 2 shillings and 6 pence. It was a laughably small amount, barely enough to fund a journey to the next town, let alone across the ocean. But it was not the size of the offering that mattered. It was the size of the faith behind it. It was a mustard seed planted in prayer and entrusted to the God who could move mountains. A society had been formed, a resolution had been passed, a handful of money and a mountain of faith had been offered up to God. But a committee and a constitution are not a mission. They were still missing the most crucial element, a person, the first one willing to have his life be the answer to the prayers he had inspired. Chapter 4. A Passage to India. The cost of obedience is often counted in goodbyes. For William Carey, the call to India meant leaving behind not just the shores of his homeland, but the entire world he'd ever known, trusting only in the quiet, steady voice of the God who had called him out upon the waters. The great resolution had been made, but now a life had to be offered. With the formation of the new society, the question hung in the air. of every meeting, who will be the first to go? The answer seemed as clear as it was daunting. The call that had been born in William Carey's heart, the burden that had fueled his sermon and his inquiry, now came to rest squarely upon his own shoulders. He had never intended to simply inspire others to the work. He had always known that he must be willing to lead the way. He and his partner, John Thomas, a surgeon who had spent time in Bengal and shared a passion for the gospel, were appointed as the society's first missionaries. The dream was becoming a reality, but with it came the weight of its immense personal cost. The greatest obstacles were not the vast oceans or the distant continent, but the intimate geography of his own home. He had to present this life-altering decision to his family. His wife, Dorothy, was a woman of simple and quiet habits. She was a devoted mother to their 3 young sons, and she was pregnant with their 4th. Her world was the small, familiar circle of family and village life. She could not read or write, and the tales of India that she had heard were frightening stories of disease, dangerous animals, and incomprehensible customs. To her, the idea of leaving England was not a grand spiritual adventure. It was a terrifying leap into a dark and dangerous unknown. William's calling was not yet her own, and her heart was filled with a deep and understandable fear for the safety of her children. The conversations between them were filled with a gentle tension, a quiet struggle between a husband's divine conviction and a wife's maternal instinct. How could she agree to take her children across the world, away from everything safe and familiar? Her refusal was firm, born not of a rebellious spirit, but of a loving and protective heart. It was a heartbreaking impasse. William was faced with an impossible choice: to abandon the call of God or to go without the family he adored. With immense sorrow, a compromise was reached. William would go to India with their eldest son, Felix, while Dorothy and the younger boys would remain in England. It was a solution that satisfied no one, a painful tearing of the family fabric. As they prepared to depart, the challenges mounted. The powerful East India Company, the effective ruler of British territories in India, was deeply opposed to missionary work. They saw it as a threat to social stability and their commercial interests. When Carey and Thomas sought passage on a company ship, they were flatly refused. The door to India seemed to have been shut and locked by the most powerful institution of the day. For a moment, it felt as if the entire venture might fail before it had even begun. But the God who had called them was a God who makes a way where there is no way. They soon learned of a Danish vessel, the Kronprinsessa Maria, scheduled to sail for India from the port of London. As a ship from another nation, it was not subject to the East India Company's restrictive policies. It was a small window of opportunity, a clear sign of God's providence. In the midst of this breakthrough, another quiet miracle was unfolding. In the final days before the sailing, John Thomas made one last, heartfelt appeal to Dorothy. He painted a picture not of the dangers of India, but of the deep sorrow of a divided family. His words, combined with William's patient love, finally softened her heart. In a sudden and emotional reversal, she agreed to go on the condition that her sister came with them to help. With a flurry of last-minute activity, the entire family, now including a newborn son, Jabez, was brought to the ship. The family was whole again, an answer to prayer that brought a deep and settled peace to William's heart. as he prepared to face the unknown. In June of 1793, the Kronprinsessa Maria lifted its anchor and sailed out onto the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic. The voyage would last for 5 long months. For the Carey family, it was a passage between worlds. The rolling green hills of England slowly disappeared over the horizon, their last glimpse of the only home they had ever known. Life became a simple, contained rhythm, dictated by the movement of the sun and the moods of the sea. The ship was their entire world, a small, self-contained vessel of wood and canvas, suspended between an endless sky above and the fathomless deep below. The days were filled with the constant creaking of the ship's timbers, the snap of the sails in the wind, and the steady, rhythmic rush of water against the hull. For the children, it was an adventure. For Dorothy, it was a time of anxious adjustment. And for William, it was a floating sanctuary, a prolonged and welcome pause between the call and the commencement of the work. He did not waste a moment. Every day, he sat with John Thomas, diligently studying the Bengali language. He began the work that would define his life, making his first tentative attempts at translating the book of Genesis into the tongue of the people he was sailing to meet. The ship's cabin was his new workshop, the open sea his new place of quiet study. They sailed south, crossing the equator, the constellations shifting in the night sky. The sheer scale of God's creation was on display every day, from the brilliant sunrises that painted the ocean with color to the deep, silent nights where the stars felt close enough to touch. It was a time of enforced dependence, a daily reminder that they were held in the hands of the one who holds the oceans in the hollow of his hand. Finally, after months at sea, the lookout's cry of "Land ho!" signaled the end of their journey. In November, they sailed up the Hooghly River, a tributary of the great Ganges, and arrived at the port of Calcutta. The moment they stepped ashore, they were plunged into a world that overwhelmed every one of their senses. The gentle, pastoral quiet of Northamptonshire was replaced by a deafening wall of sound, the clamor of voices in a dozen unknown languages, the ringing of bells, the cries of vendors. The air, thick with the heat and humidity they had never experienced, was a complex mixture of unfamiliar smells, fragrant spices, incense, wood smoke, and the damp, earthy scent of the river. The scene before them was a riot of vibrant color, a sea of humanity that moved with a purpose and energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. This was India. It was beautiful, chaotic, and utterly alien. They were strangers in a strange land, their funds already dangerously low. The grand vision that had been born in a quiet English workshop had now collided with a harsh and bewildering reality. The great attempt, born of a great expectation, had now truly begun. They stood together as a family on the crowded shores of Bengal, having left behind everything they knew and everything they owned. The long passage was over, but a far more difficult journey. A journey into a wilderness of hardship and uncertainty was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Wilderness Years. Faith is not always found in the victorious shout or in the parting of a sea. More often, it is discovered in the quiet whisper that perseveres through years of silence, in the steady, hopeful heart that continues to trust in the goodness of God when all evidence seems to point to the contrary. For William Carey, the shores of India were not a promised land of immediate harvest. but the beginning of a long and painful journey into the wilderness. The vibrant, chaotic energy of Calcutta quickly gave way to the stark reality of their situation. The small fund provided by the Missionary Society had been exhausted, and the dream of a self-sufficient mission seemed to evaporate in the humid Bengal air. With no home, no income, and a growing family to feed, William was faced with the humbling task of simple survival. His partner, John Thomas, proved to be an unreliable steward of their shared finances, and soon the Carey family found themselves utterly destitute. They moved from the city into a desolate, swampy region, a place of deep poverty and rampant disease. The romantic vision of bringing light to a distant land was replaced by the daily grinding struggle for their next meal. This was not the mission field they had imagined. This was a place of profound isolation, a testing ground that would stretch their faith to its breaking point. It was in this desperate state that God, in His providence, provided a lifeline. An acquaintance offered William the position of superintendent at an indigo factory in a remote area called Mudnabati. For a man who had come to preach the gospel, accepting a commercial, secular post might have felt like a defeat, a detour from his sacred calling. But William saw it as God's own hand, providing a means to care for his family and a place to put down roots. It was an act of profound humility, a willingness to set aside his own plans and accept the path God was laying before him. The work at the indigo factory was demanding. It was an agricultural and industrial process, turning a simple green plant into a precious blue dye. William applied himself to the task with his characteristic diligence. He learned the intricacies of the trade, managed the local workers, and oversaw the entire operation. This was not a distraction from his mission. It became an integral part of it. The factory gave him a legitimate reason to live among the people. It provided a stable home and a steady income. And most importantly, it immersed him in the daily life, language, and culture of rural Bengal in a way that simply preaching never could. He was not just a foreign teacher, he was a participant in the local economy, a manager who worked alongside the people he had come to serve. He built a school for the local children. He began to experiment with agriculture, seeking to improve the local crops, an expression of his lifelong love for botany and his desire to care for both the spiritual and physical needs of the people. But this season of provision was also a time of unimaginable sorrow. The wilderness was not just a place of financial hardship, but of deep and piercing personal grief. It was here, in this isolated outpost, that disease struck their family. Their bright, beautiful 5-year-old son, Peter, was taken by dysentery. To lose a child is the deepest pain a parent can know. To lose a child in a foreign land, thousands of miles from the comfort of home and extended family, is a grief of profound and lonely depths. They buried their son in that strange, hard soil, a part of their own hearts buried with him. For Dorothy, this loss was the final, unbearable weight upon a spirit already crushed by fear and culture shock. The vibrant, chaotic world of India had terrified her from the moment she arrived. The loss of her child, combined with the intense isolation and her own feelings of inadequacy, became too much for her fragile mind to bear. Her mental health, already strained, began to completely unravel. She suffered from delusions, believing that her husband was unfaithful her mind lost in a labyrinth of suspicion and fear from which it would never emerge. William now found himself not only a grieving father and a missionary in a resistant land, but also the full-time caregiver for a wife who no longer knew him, her presence a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the deep human cost of their journey. Amidst this landscape of personal tragedy, another kind of silence pervaded his life, a spiritual silence. He had come to India with a heart full of hope, expecting a great harvest of souls. He preached regularly in the local villages. He spoke with anyone who would listen, sharing the story of God's love with gentleness and clarity. He lived a life of integrity and compassion among the workers at his factory. Yet, for 7 full years, there was nothing. Not a single person came to be faith. Not one heart was turned. The spiritual ground was as hard and unyielding as the baked earth in the dry season. Year after year, he planted the seeds of the gospel, and year after year, there was no fruit. The great attempt, born of a great expectation, seemed to be yielding nothing but hardship and sorrow. It would have been so easy to become discouraged, to believe that he'd been mistaken, that God had abandoned him in this lonely wilderness. But in the darkest hours of the night, after the long day's work at the factory was done and the household was finally quiet, William would light his lamp, open his books, and continue his true life's work. The translation of the Bible into Bengali became his anchor in the storm, his sanctuary in the midst of his sorrow. This quiet, methodical, and unseen labor was an act of pure and defiant faith. It was his way of whispering back to the silence. He may not have been able to see a single sprout, but he would continue to sow the imperishable seed of God's word. Word by word, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, he worked, his pen scratching across the page in the stillness of the night. This disciplined work saved him. It gave him a holy purpose when all other purposes seemed to be failing. It was a tangible expression of his unwavering belief that God's promises were true, regardless of his circumstances. He was translating the words of hope, and in doing so, he was preaching them to his own soul. These were the wilderness years, a time of profound and painful stripping away. God was removing every external thing he could have possibly relied upon: financial security, the support of his spouse, visible success in his ministry, and even the health of his own children. He was being taught to depend not on the signs of God's blessing, but on the simple, unshakable reality of God's presence. He was learning to walk by faith and not by sight in the deepest and most literal way. 7 years is a long time to wait for a single drop of rain. It is a long time to labor in a field that yields no harvest. The first chapter of his life in India was written with tears, filled with the pain of loss and the ache of unanswered prayer. But the God he served is a God of seasons. And even in the longest and harshest of winters, when the ground is frozen and life seems to have vanished, a promise of spring lies sleeping, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Chapter 6. A light in Serampore. After a long and barren winter, the first signs of spring can feel like a miracle of grace. For William Carey, after 7 years of lonely struggle in the wilderness, the arrival of fellow laborers was the beginning of a new season, a turning of the page to a chapter of shared hope and divine provision. An answer to a prayer he had almost forgotten how to pray was about to arrive on the tide. The season of trial at the indigo factory came to an end not with a spiritual breakthrough, but with a commercial failure. The factory closed, leaving William and his family once again without a home and without an income. From the outside, it might have looked like yet another setback, another defeat in a long line of disappointments. But God's purposes are often hidden within what we perceive as failure. He was gently closing a door in a remote and lonely outpost, only to open a gate into a place of fellowship and fruitful labor. At this very time, a ship from England was making its way toward the coast of Bengal. On board was a new group of missionaries sent by the society in England, their hearts full of a passion that Carey himself had ignited years before. Among them were two men who would become his closest partners for the rest of his life. One was William Ward, a master printer, a practical man who knew how to turn ideas into ink on a page. The other was Joshua Marshman, a gifted and scholarly schoolteacher, a man with a passion for education, accompanied by his equally brilliant and dedicated wife, Hannah. Their arrival, however, was met with immediate hostility. The British East India Company, still suspicious of any missionary activity, refused them permission to settle in Calcutta. The new arrivals were ordered to leave India on the next available ship. It was a devastating blow, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle placed before them at the very threshold of their calling. But just as he had done for Carey years before, God had prepared a place of refuge. A few miles north of Calcutta, on the tranquil banks of the Hooghly River, lay the small Danish settlement of Serampore. It was a clean, orderly, and peaceful town, administered by the Danish governor, Colonel B, who was a man sympathetic to the Christian faith. Hearing of the missionaries' plight, he offered them not just a welcome, but his official protection. Serampore was a sanctuary, a small island of safety in a sea of opposition. When word of this reached William Carey in his remote village, he knew that the years of isolation were over. He packed his few belongings, his precious translation manuscripts, and his family, and made the journey downriver to join these men he had never met, but who were already his brothers. The first meeting of William Carey, William Ward, and Joshua Marshman was not a formal affair, but it was a moment of profound, spirit-led significance. As they spoke together, they recognized in each other the missing pieces of a divine puzzle. Their gifts were perfectly complementary. Carey was the visionary, the brilliant linguist and translator who had spent years painstakingly rendering the scriptures into Bengali. But without a printer, his translations were just ink on paper, confined to a single manuscript. Ward was that printer, the practical craftsman who could build the engine that would multiply God's word 1,000-fold. Marshman was the educator, the man who could build the schools that would teach a generation to read the scriptures that Ward would print. It was a divinely appointed partnership, a threefold cord not easily broken. They would come to be known as the Serampore Trio, a brotherhood of purpose that would change the face of India. Recognizing the hand of God in bringing them together, they made a radical decision. They would not establish separate homes or separate ministries. They would become one family, united in purpose and in life. They purchased a large house, spacious enough for all their families and the work of the mission, and there they established a communal way of life. To govern their community, they drew up a document called the Serampore Covenant. It was a simple but profound agreement that laid out the principles of their life together. They agreed to pool all of their earnings from every source into a common treasury. From this fund, each family would draw only what was necessary for a simple, frugal life. They would eat their meals together at a common table. They would meet regularly for prayer and fellowship, and every surplus shilling would be poured directly back into the work of the mission, to fund the printing press, to support the schools, and to spread the gospel. It was a remarkable act of mutual trust and self-denial, a living embodiment of the early church. For William Carey, after so many years of solitary struggle and bearing his burdens alone, this community was like water in a desert. He was no longer a lonely voice in the wilderness, but a valued member of a loving and supportive family, his spirit lifted by the daily encouragement of his friends. With the foundation of their community firmly established, they immediately set to work, creating the tools they would need for the harvest that they now expected. The centerpiece of the new mission was the printing press. William Ward, with his expert knowledge, had brought a press from England. With great excitement and prayer, they uncrated it and assembled it in its new home. It was a beautiful cast iron machine, and to them, it was far more precious than gold. It was an instrument of light, the means by which the words of life, which Carey had so painstakingly translated, could finally be placed into the hands of the people. It stood in the workshop, a silent but powerful promise of all that was to come. While Ward was setting up his press, Joshua and Hannah Marshman were busy establishing their schools. With a deep conviction that education and the gospel went hand in hand, they opened schools for children from all backgrounds, boys and girls, rich and poor, from every caste. They envisioned a place of learning that would not only equip students with knowledge, but also shape their character with the values of the Christian faith. The sound of children learning to read and write soon filled the mission compound, a joyful noise that signaled a new future. And at the heart of it all, they established a church, a place for weekly worship in the Bengali language, a spiritual home where all were welcome. The mission at Serampore was no longer just a dream. It was a vibrant, bustling reality. It was a home, a school, a print shop, and a church. It was a community bound together by a shared love for God and a shared vision for India. The long, difficult years of silent sowing were over. The season of waiting had ended. Now, surrounded by his faithful friends, with the tools of the harvest in his hands, William Carey could look to the future with a renewed and certain hope. The ground had been prepared. The fellowship was strong. The printing press stood ready. All the pieces were finally in place, waiting for the one thing they had longed for, the one thing they had prayed for all these years, the first true fruit from the hard soil of Bengal. Chapter 7. The First Fruit. How long can one wait for a single drop of rain in a parched and thirsty land? For 7 years, the spiritual soil of Bengal had been hard and dry, but a small band of believers continued to pray for a cloud to appear on the horizon. And then, in the life of a single, humble man, the long drought broke, and the first drops of a monsoon of grace began to fall. The mission at Serampore was a hive of hopeful activity. The printing press was operational, the schools were filled with the sounds of learning, and the church doors were open. Yet, the central prayer of the community remained unanswered. The years of spiritual silence that had marked William Carey's time in the wilderness had followed him here. He and his friends preached, they taught, they served the community with love, and they waited. They held fast to the promise that God's word would not return empty, and they continued to sow the seed with patient faith, trusting that in His own perfect time, God would bring the growth. And then, one day, a man with a dislocated arm was carried to their door, and everything began to change. His name was Krishna Pal. He was a carpenter by trade, a man of the Shudra caste, skilled with his hands and respected in his community. He was a devout Hindu, a man who had spent his life in the sincere worship of the gods of his ancestors. He knew nothing of the missionaries or their message until an accident left him in excruciating pain. Having found no relief from traditional healers and hearing that the foreigners possessed some medical skill, he sent a message to the mission pleading for help. Carey and his friends responded immediately. They went to Krishna Pal's home, and seeing the severity of his injury, they treated him with gentle and effective care. But they offered him more than just physical healing. In the quiet conversations that followed, as they tended to his arm, they spoke to him of another kind of healing, a spiritual wholeness offered by a God named Jesus, who was a carpenter just like him. Krishna Pal listened. He was moved not by a clever argument or a theological debate, but by the simple, unexpected kindness he had been shown. These men had cared for him, a stranger, with a compassion that sought nothing in return. His curiosity was piqued. He and his family began to make the journey to the mission compound on Sundays, to sit quietly and listen to the preaching. The story they heard was unlike any they had known. It was a story of a single, all-powerful God who loved the world so much that He had sent His only Son. It was a story of grace, of forgiveness offered freely to all, regardless of their caste or their past. For Krishna Pal, whose life had been defined by a complex system of rituals and duties, this message of simple, loving grace was like a cool drink of water to a thirsty soul. The seed of the gospel, so long sown on hard ground, had finally found a patch of fertile soil. Over several weeks, a quiet and profound transformation took place in his heart. The truth of the message settled upon him, not with the force of a storm, but with the gentle clarity of a sunrise. He came to believe. He decided to give his life to this new carpenter king. For a person in 18th century Bengal, this was no small decision. It was a choice that would cost him everything. To become a Christian, Krishna Pal would have to be baptized, and in that public act, he would be deliberately and irreversibly breaking caste. The caste system was the rigid, unshakable foundation of Hindu society, a sacred order that dictated every aspect of a person's life, their job, their marriage, their social standing. To defy it was to commit the ultimate transgression. It meant being cast out from his community, disowned by his relatives, and treated as if he were dead. It meant the loss of his livelihood, his identity, and his place in the world. When word of his intention spread, the reaction was swift and furious. A mob of more than 2,000 people, enraged by this act of spiritual rebellion, descended on his home, They threatened him, they insulted the missionaries, and they tried to drag his wife and daughter away from him by force. But Krishnapal, his heart now anchored in a new and unshakable peace, stood firm. The faith that had been so gently planted had now grown a root of courage, strong enough to withstand the fiercest of storms. And so, on a quiet Sunday, the 28th of December in the year 1800, a small, determined group made their way to the banks of the Hooghly River. It was Krishnapal, his wife, his daughters, and his brother. They were walking toward the very river that their people held as sacred, but they were going to enter it not to wash away their sins through ritual, but to declare their allegiance to the one who had washed their sins away forever. The scene of the first baptism was one of solemn and beautiful simplicity. A small crowd had gathered on the riverbank to watch, including the Danish governor and other residents of Serampore. William Carey, his heart overflowing with the joy he had waited 7 long years to experience, waded out into the gentle current. He was followed by his own son, Felix, who had also chosen this day to be baptized, and then by the man who represented the fulfillment of a lifetime of prayer, Krishnapal. The baptismal words were spoken not in English or in Latin, but in the rich, flowing syllables of Bengali, the language of Krishnapal's own heart. As William Carey lowered the carpenter into the water and raised him up again, a profound and holy transaction was made visible. A man of India, baptized by a man from England in the name of a Savior who was born in the Middle East. It was a living picture of the gospel, a force powerful enough to break down the walls that divide humanity, the walls of caste, of culture, of race, and of nation. As Krishnapal rose from the water, his face shining with a quiet joy, the memory of another place and another time seemed to hang in the air. One could almost see the image of a young cobbler in a small English workshop, his finger resting on the subcontinent of India on a globe made of leather scraps, his lips moving in a silent, hopeful prayer. Krishnapal was the answer to that prayer. He was the first fruit of a harvest that had been sown in tears and tended with a faith that refused to give up. He was the living proof that God had been listening all along, that the long, barren years in the wilderness had not been in vain. The work had been difficult, the sorrows had been many, but on that day, standing in the waters of the Hooghly, the promise was made real. The spiritual drought was finally over. The first precious sheaf of the harvest had been gathered in. Now, with the undeniable evidence of God's power before them, the real work of multiplying the word that had changed this man's life could begin in earnest. Chapter 8. The word made plain. To hear God speak in the language of your childhood, in the familiar cadence and rhythm of your mother tongue, is to feel a truth not just in your mind, but in the very chambers of your heart. This was the gift William Carey dedicated his life to giving. He was a translator, a man who patiently and lovingly carried the words of life across the chasm of language so that all could understand. The baptism of Krishnapal was more than just a single victory. It was a profound confirmation. It was the undeniable proof that the gospel was not a Western story, but a universal truth that could take root and flourish in the soil of Bengal. This one conversion created a new and urgent sense of purpose at the Serampore mission. It was no longer enough for the word to be spoken by a few foreign preachers. It had to be made available for all to read, to study, and to hold in their own hands. The focus of the mission now turned to its quiet, intellectual, and spiritual heart, the translation office, William Carey's humble study. Here, day after day, year after year, he undertook a task of monumental scale, a work that would become his greatest legacy. The room was a sanctuary of scholarship, lined with books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink. Manuscripts in Hebrew, Greek, and a dozen Indian languages lay open on his desk, a testament to a mind that was constantly moving between worlds. This was the engine room of the mission, the place where the slow, patient, and prayerful work was done. Translating the Bible is a task of immense and delicate complexity. It is far more than simply replacing one word with another. A word is not just a definition. It is a vessel that carries within it a whole world of culture, history, and nuance. To translate faithfully is to understand the precise meaning of the original text, and then to find a way to express that same meaning with equal power and beauty in a completely different language. It is an act of scholarship, but it is also an act of art. And for William Carey, it was ultimately an act of worship. He approached the task with a profound sense of humility and a relentless commitment to accuracy. He did not work alone. He understood that as a foreigner, he could never fully master the subtle idioms and rhythms of the local tongues. And so, he gathered around him a team of learned Indian scholars, or pundits, men who had spent their lives studying the classical and vernacular languages of their homeland. The process was a beautiful model of respectful collaboration. Carey, with his unparalleled knowledge of the biblical languages, would sit with these scholars for hours each day. He would explain the meaning of a Greek or Hebrew phrase, its grammatical structure, its theological weight. The pundits would then listen, and with their deep, intuitive understanding of their own language, they would suggest the best way to capture that meaning in Bengali, or Sanskrit, or Marathi. They would debate the choice of a single word for hours, searching for the one that would perfectly convey the intended truth. It was a slow, painstaking process, a meeting of minds and cultures, all in the service of making God's word plain. This work was fueled by a deep and abiding love. Carey was not just a scholar. He was a man who genuinely loved and respected the people of India and their rich linguistic heritage. He saw their languages not as obstacles to be overcome, but as beautiful, God-given instruments, fully capable of communicating the deepest truths of the universe. He was not trying to replace their language with English. He was seeking to enrich it with the timeless story of the gospel. In the year 1801, the mission reached a historic milestone. After years of labor that had begun long before, in the lonely wilderness of Mudnabati, the first complete Bengali New Testament was ready. The final manuscript pages were carried from Carey's study to the print shop, where William Ward and his team had been preparing for this moment. With great reverence, they set the metal type, piece by piece, locking the Bengali characters into place. And then, the first pages were pulled from the press. The smell of fresh ink on paper filled the room. It was a moment of quiet, profound triumph. For the very first time in history, the people of Bengal could read the words of Jesus in their own language. The Word had put on the flesh and blood of their own tongue. The Serampore press now sprang to life. It became a fountain of knowledge, sending streams of literature out into the surrounding country. Copies of the New Testament were printed and distributed, but the work did not stop there. Carey understood that to truly understand the Bible, people needed to understand language itself. And so, the press also produced grammars and dictionaries, foundational tools for literacy and learning. They printed school books for the mission schools and even translated and printed some of the great works of Indian classical literature, like the Ramayana, preserving the cultural heritage of the land. Serampore was becoming one of the most important centers of learning in all of Asia. Yet, for Carey, the completion of the Bengali Bible was not an end, but a beginning. Bengal was just one region of a vast and linguistically diverse subcontinent. His vision began to expand. His gaze turned to the other great languages of India. He began the monumental task of translating the scriptures into Sanskrit, the ancient, classical language of the Hindu scriptures, the language of scholars and priests. He believed that if the Bible were available in Sanskrit, it would be taken seriously by the intellectual leaders of the country. From there, the work branched out in every direction, like a great river separating into dozens of life-giving streams. He and his team began translations into Oriya for the people on the eastern coast, into Marathi for the people of the west, into Hindi, the great language of the north, and into Assamese for the people of the remote northeastern hills. The scope of the undertaking was almost beyond comprehension. Carey's method was as brilliant as it was efficient. He would master a primary language like Bengali or Sanskrit, and then, because many of the languages of North India are related, he could use that knowledge as a bridge to begin work on another. He always worked with native speakers of each language, ensuring that the final translation was not the work of a foreigner, but was authentic and natural to the people who would read it. His days fell into a steady, disciplined rhythm. He would rise early, spend time in prayer and personal study, and then begin the long hours of translation, surrounded by his team of pundits. His work ethic was relentless, but it was not frantic. It was the calm, patient, and persistent pace of a man who knew he was engaged in a task of eternal significance. In his lifetime, William Carey, together with his colleagues at Serampore, would translate the entire Bible into 6 different languages, the New Testament into another 23, and portions of the scripture into 10 more. It was a linguistic achievement without parallel in human history. The word was being made plain. From the small, peaceful mission at Serampore, a quiet and powerful light was beginning to shine. The scriptures, now dressed in the languages of the people, were being sent out like seeds on the wind, ready to take root in hearts and minds all across the vast land of India. This growing light, this fountain of learning and translation, did not go unnoticed. It soon began to attract the attention of the British authorities in the great city of Calcutta, leading to an unexpected and highly unusual invitation that would test the humility of this former shoemaker in a way he had never imagined. Chapter 9. The Professor and the Preacher. In a city of earthly power, in a college built to train the architects of an empire, a humble missionary was unexpectedly given a seat of great honor. Yet he walked through those halls of prestige with a heart that never forgot its true purpose. A man who knew that his ultimate calling was not to earn the acclaim of men, but to faithfully serve a heavenly king. The center of British power in India was the city of Calcutta, and the intellectual heart of that power was a grand new institution called Fort William College. It was established at the dawn of the 19th century by the Governor-General himself, Lord Wellesley. Its purpose was ambitious and strategic: to take the young British men who had come to India as clerks and administrators and transform them into effective rulers. To do this, they needed to understand the vast and complex land they now governed. They needed to learn its languages, its laws, its religions, and its cultures. Fort William was to be the Oxford or Cambridge of the East, a place of immense prestige, secular learning, and political influence. But the college immediately faced a significant problem. In their search for faculty, they could find no one in the entire British establishment with a scholarly and practical mastery of the local languages, especially Bengali. The very language of the people they sought to govern was a closed book to them. The search for a qualified professor seemed fruitless until a name was mentioned that surprised everyone. It was the name of a dissenting missionary, a man with no formal university degree, who was living under Danish protection in the quiet town of Serampore. It was the name of the self-taught linguist who, through years of patient scholarly labor, had become the undisputed master of the Bengali tongue. It was the name of William Carey. An official invitation was sent from the Governor-General's office to the mission house at Serampore. It was a remarkable and wholly unexpected development. The same British authorities who had forbidden missionaries from even settling on their land were now inviting one to become a professor in the most prestigious college. It was a clear and undeniable act of God's providence, a quiet turning of the tables. God was opening a door into the very heart of the empire, a door that no man, no law, and no company policy could shut. William and his colleagues considered the offer with careful prayer. He had no desire for personal honor or worldly titles. Their first concern was whether such a position would hinder his primary calling as a missionary. But as they prayed, they began to see the strategic wisdom of God's plan. The post would provide a substantial salary, which could be used to fund their ever-expanding translation work. It would lend an air of legitimacy and respectability to the mission, shielding it from the suspicion of local officials. And it would give William access to the highest levels of government, a platform from which he could speak on matters of justice and conscience. He accepted the appointment not as a change in career, but as an expansion of his mission field. And so, a new rhythm began. Several times a week, William would make the journey by boat down the Hooghly River, traveling from the peaceful, faith-filled community of Serampore into the bustling, power-driven world of Calcutta. It was a journey between his two lives, the life of the preacher and translator, and the life of the esteemed college professor. At Fort William, he was a revelation. He taught with a gentleness, a patience, and a depth of knowledge that quickly earned him the love and admiration of his students and the respect of his fellow professors. His initial appointment as professor of Bengali was soon expanded to include professorships in Sanskrit and Marathi as well. The grammars and dictionaries he had been writing for his missionary work now became the official textbooks for the British government. The humble shoemaker from a small English village was now the chief linguistic authority for the British Empire in India. In this new environment of academic and social prestige, his own deep humility shone with a quiet brilliance. He never tried to hide his simple origins or put on the airs of a high-born gentleman. He remained who he was, a servant of God who happened to be a professor. A famous story is told of a dinner party attended by the highest officials in Calcutta. An arrogant officer, hoping to humiliate Carey in front of the assembled guests, said in a loud voice, "I believe, Mr. Carey, you were once a shoemaker?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the missionary professor. Without a moment's hesitation, and with a gentle smile, William replied, "No, your lordship, not a shoemaker, only a cobbler." The distinction was a mark of his profound humility. A shoemaker was a skilled artisan who created new shoes. A cobbler was a simple mender of old ones. In that one quiet sentence, he had not only disarmed his critic, but he had declared to a room full of powerful men that his identity was not found in his past profession or his present one, but in a grace that had found him in his lowliness. He viewed his position at the college not as a personal achievement, but as a stewardship, a resource to be used entirely for the glory of God. The generous salary he received, a sum that could have made him a wealthy man, was never treated as his own. Every single rupee was paid directly into the common fund at Serampore. He kept for himself only a tiny allowance for his most basic needs. This one man's salary became the financial engine that drove the translation of the Bible into dozens of languages, that funded the printing press, and that supported the mission schools. He was a living example of a life poured out for the sake of the gospel. Furthermore, his position gave him a voice. He was no longer just a missionary who could be easily dismissed. He was Professor Carey, a respected scholar of the government. This influence would become a crucial tool in the great moral battles that lay ahead. And finally, his very presence at the college was a quiet and powerful witness. In a world of ambition, political maneuvering, and cynical self-interest, his character stood apart. His integrity, his gentleness, his immense intellect, and his unwavering devotion to his God preached a silent sermon every day in the halls of Fort William. As the evening would fall, the professor would make his way back to the river, to the boat that would carry him home. He would leave the noise and the politics of the great city behind, his heart turning towards Serampore, his true home. He had walked in the corridors of power and earned the respect of the powerful, but his heart remained with the ordinary people of India and with the great work of the gospel. His new position had given him a platform, and he was about to use it to speak for those who had no voice at all. Chapter 10. The Unseen Battle. True courage is not always found on a battlefield with the clash of swords. Sometimes the deepest courage is found in the quiet, steady heart that chooses to stand against an ancient darkness, a darkness that everyone else has simply learned to accept as normal. It is the courage to see a great wrong and to refuse to look away. As William Carey's years in India unfolded, his love for the land and its people deepened. He saw in their culture a rich tapestry of art, literature, and deep philosophical thought. But his growing intimacy with the life of Bengal also opened his eyes to some of its most profound sorrows, to the hidden wounds of a society held in the grip of ancient and unforgiving traditions. And there was one custom, one practice that grieved his spirit more than any other. It was the practice known as sati. With the utmost gentleness, we must understand what this was. It was a custom prevalent in some parts of India, where a widow, upon the death of her husband, was compelled by immense social and religious pressure to place herself upon his funeral pyre, to be consumed by the same flames that took his body. She was told it was an act of supreme devotion, a path to purification for her and her husband. But Carey, whose heart was shaped by the gospel of a God who cherishes life, saw it for what it was, a cruel and tragic injustice. He saw a system that rendered a woman's life as having no value apart from her husband's, a custom that turned the deep grief of widowhood into a terrifying and final act of despair. Not long after arriving in India, Carey witnessed the rite of sati for the first time. He and his friend John Thomas came upon a procession and learned of its purpose. They pleaded with the woman, with the priests, with the officials, but their protests were ignored. From a distance, they watched the smoke rise against the sky, and the experience seared itself into Carey's conscience. The abstract knowledge of the practice had now become a personal and haunting memory. He returned to his home that day, a changed man, with a holy resolve settled deep in his soul. He knew that he could not be a faithful servant of the God of life and remain silent in the face of such a celebration of death. He knew he had to act, but his approach was not that of a loud, angry crusader. That was not his way. His battle against sati would be a quiet and methodical campaign, a patient and relentless appeal to the conscience, fought over many years with the tools he knew best: scholarship, data, and a gentle, unwavering persuasion. His first step was to move the issue from the realm of anecdote into the realm of undeniable fact. He began a careful and systematic investigation. Using his network of friends and contacts throughout Bengal, he started to collect data to document every single case of sati that occurred within a 30-mile radius of Calcutta. He recorded the names, the places, the dates, the details. For the first time, the true and horrifying scale of the practice was being meticulously catalogued. He was compiling a ledger of grief, turning vague reports into a body of evidence that could not be easily dismissed by the British authorities. But his argument was not merely statistical, it was also theological and scholarly. With his team of learned pundits, he undertook a deep and respectful study of the most ancient and sacred texts of the Hindu faith, the Vedas. He wanted to understand if this terrible custom was truly commanded by their own scriptures. After long and careful research, he made a groundbreaking discovery. The ancient texts did not command widows to burn themselves. In fact, a key passage that was often used to justify the practice was based on a tragic misunderstanding, a misreading of a single word. The original texts actually instructed a widow to return from the pyre and to resume her life. The practice of sati was not a foundational part of the religion, but a later, terrible corruption. This was a crucial insight. It allowed Carey to argue against the practice not as a foreigner imposing his own beliefs, but as a scholar appealing to the highest and oldest ideals of the Hindu faith itself. With his evidence in hand, he began a quiet campaign to change hearts and minds. He used the powerful tool of the Serampore press to publish essays and articles in both English and in Bengali. He laid out his findings calmly and logically. He made a compassionate appeal to the innate human sense of justice. He was not just condemning a practice, he was pleading for the lives of the most vulnerable members of society. He then took his battle to the corridors of power. His position as a respected professor at Fort William College gave him access to the highest levels of the British government. He presented his reports to governors and officials. He shared his scholarly findings. He patiently, persistently, year after year, urged them to use their authority to outlaw this practice. He was met with immense resistance. Many British officials, following a strict policy of non-interference in religious matters, were terrified of causing a popular uprising. They argued that it was not their place to meddle with the ancient customs of the land, no matter how troubling they might seem. But William Carey would not be deterred. This work was for him an essential expression of his Christian faith. He believed that the gospel was not just about saving souls for the next life. It was also about bringing justice, mercy, and compassion into this one. He was living out the biblical command to seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. To love God with all his heart meant that he must also love his neighbor, and that love had to be more than just words. It had to be action, it had to be advocacy, it had to be a voice for the voiceless. For more than 25 years, he fought this unseen battle. He wrote, he spoke, he researched, and he prayed. He endured setbacks, apathy, and outright opposition. It was a long, slow, and often discouraging work. The funeral pyres continued to burn, and the lives of countless women were tragically lost. But the seeds of justice, once planted, had taken root. A new conversation had begun. The conscience of the government and of the Indian people themselves was being slowly and gently awakened. A powerful and respected voice was now speaking, day after day, year after year, for those who could not speak for themselves, and that steady, quiet voice could not be silenced. Chapter 11. A garden in the East. To plant a seed in the earth is a quiet act of hope. It is a humble partnership with the Creator, a patient trust in the unseen promise of life. For William Carey, to tend to a garden was more than a simple hobby. It was a way of walking with God, a form of worship that honored the beauty and order of the world he had made. In the midst of the monumental labors of translation and the profound moral struggle against injustice, there was another, quieter side to William Carey's life. It was a passion that had been with him since his earliest days as a curious boy in the English countryside. It was his deep and abiding love for the natural world. Long before he had mastered the complexities of Greek and Hebrew, he had been a student of the language of creation. He had learned the names of the wildflowers, studied the habits of the birds, and marveled at the intricate design of the smallest insect. For him, the world was not a random collection of things, but a book written by the hand of God. Each living creature a word, each landscape a sentence, all telling the grand story of a wise and benevolent Creator. This childhood fascination never left him. It was a green and living thread that wove itself through his entire life, a source of peace, wonder, and deep spiritual insight. When the mission was established at Serampore, one of the first things he did was set aside a plot of land for a garden. But this was to be no ordinary vegetable patch. Over the years, With the same patient diligence he applied to his translations, he created a botanical garden that became one of the most magnificent in all of Asia. It was a place of serene and ordered beauty, a quiet sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the world outside its walls. He designed it with the thoughtful precision of a scientist, laying out the beds in neat geometric patterns. He filled it with an astonishing variety of plants, collecting specimens from all across India and corresponding with botanists around the world to acquire rare and exotic seeds. The garden was divided into sections, a living library of God's creative genius. There were avenues of tall trees, neat rows of medicinal herbs, vibrant beds of English flowers growing alongside the brilliant blossoms of the tropics, and plots for agricultural experiments. Early in the morning, before the heat of the day set in, this garden was his sanctuary. He would walk its peaceful paths, observing the slow unfurling of a new leaf, examining the delicate structure of a flower, his heart filled with a quiet sense of awe. For Carey, botany and theology were inseparable. He believed that one could learn as much about the character of God from studying the intricate design of a lily as from studying a page of scripture. The same intelligence, the same love of order, the same delight in beauty and variety were evident in both. His garden was a place of prayer, a place of study, and a place where his soul found rest. But William Carey's faith was never a purely private or contemplative matter. It was a practical faith that always flowed outward in loving service to others. His beautiful garden was not just a personal refuge, it became a laboratory for the betterment of the people he'd come to serve. He looked at the land around him and saw the struggles of the local farmers. He saw their crops fail in times of drought, and he knew the devastation of the famines that periodically swept through the country. His compassionate heart was moved not just for their spiritual poverty, but for their physical poverty as well. And so, he put his scientific mind to work. He used his garden as a place of agricultural research, experimenting with new crops and better farming techniques. He introduced new varieties of fruits and vegetables that could thrive in the Indian climate. With the methodical care of a true scientist, he pioneered the practice of crop rotation, teaching farmers how to keep their soil healthy and productive. He wrote essays on agriculture, on forestry, and on the importance of conservation, and he used the Serampore press to print and distribute this practical knowledge far and wide. He was not just offering people a hope for heaven, he was offering them tangible help for their life on earth. His work earned him the respect of the scientific community. He introduced the Linnaean system of botanical classification to India, bringing a new level of scientific order to the study of the subcontinent's incredibly diverse plant life. He corresponded with leading botanists in Europe, sending them seeds and specimens, and in return, receiving new plants to introduce into his garden. His work was a bridge between East and West, a quiet and fruitful exchange of knowledge. The culmination of this lifelong passion was the founding in the year 1820 of the Agri-Horticultural Society of India. It was not, in name, a religious or missionary organization. It was a scientific society, open to all, dedicated to the simple and noble purpose of improving the agriculture and horticulture of India. But it was born directly from his missionary heart. It was an expression of his holistic vision of the gospel, a belief that God cares for the whole person, their body, their mind, and their spirit. He believed that to help a farmer grow a better crop, to provide more food for a hungry family, was a sacred and holy work. It was a way of participating in the creative and sustaining work of God Himself, a tangible expression of the command to love your neighbor. His beautiful garden at Serampore was a living metaphor for his entire life's work. It was a place where seeds were planted in carefully prepared soil. It was tended with patience, with diligence, and with a deep and abiding hope. And in time, it produced a rich and abundant harvest, a harvest that brought beauty, nourishment, and life to all. He cultivated the soil with the same patient faith that he cultivated the soul, trusting that God, the great gardener, would surely bring the growth. The garden stood as a quiet, green, and living testament to a life dedicated to planting seeds of hope, a peaceful symbol of life, order, and the goodness of a God who makes all things beautiful in His time. But even in this tranquil place of life and growth, a trial by fire was coming, a sudden and unforeseen catastrophe that would threaten to turn all of his fruitful and patient labor into nothing more than smoke and ash. Chapter 12. The Great Fire. In a single night, the patient work of a lifetime can turn to smoke and ash. Every beautiful and carefully crafted thing is fragile in the face of the flame. But a faith that is built not on the works of our hands, but on the character of God, is a faith that is fireproof. The year was 1812, and the Serampore mission was a place of peace and flourishing productivity. Nearly 2 decades of patient labor were now bearing abundant fruit. The schools were full, the church was growing, and from the heart of the mission, the great iron printing press sent forth a steady stream of life-giving words. Day after day, William Ward, the master printer, would oversee the work, the rhythmic clatter of the machine a constant, reassuring sound. It was the sound of progress, the sound of light spreading. On the evening of March the 11th, a cool and quiet night, the work was finished for the day, and the print shop was locked and silent. But sometime in the deep of the night, a small, careless flame, perhaps from a forgotten ember, awoke in the darkness. It found a home in a stack of paper, and from that small beginning, a great and hungry fire was born. A watchman raised the alarm, his cries cutting through the stillness of the night. The entire mission community awoke and rushed to the scene, their hearts sinking at the sight of the orange glow that was consuming the very building that housed their life's work. They formed lines, passing buckets of water from the river, a desperate and futile effort against the growing inferno. The fire, fed by vast stores of paper, ink, and flammable chemicals, was now a raging torrent beyond any hope of containment. William Ward, who saw the work of his own hands being devoured, made several brave and dangerous attempts to enter the building, to save what he could, but was held back by his friends. There was nothing to be done but to stand in the darkness and watch as the roof collapsed and the heart of their mission was turned into a roaring furnace. As the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a scene of absolute devastation. Where the bustling print shop had stood just hours before, there was now only a blackened, smoking ruin. A thick, acrid smell hung in the air, the work of 12 long years, the tangible fruit of countless hours of labor and sacrifice, lay in a heap of ash and twisted, molten metal. The scale of the loss was almost impossible to comprehend. The entire stock of paper, tens of thousands of sheets imported from England at tremendous expense, was gone. The precious metal type, the carefully crafted characters for 14 different Eastern languages, had melted into a single useless mass. But the most heartbreaking loss of all was the destruction of the manuscripts. This was the loss of the irreplaceable. William Carey's monumental dictionary of the Sanskrit language, a work that had been his constant companion for years, was gone. A polyglot dictionary comparing several Asian languages was gone. Translations of ancient Indian literature were gone. And most painful of all, numerous drafts and revisions of his Bible translations, the very heart of his calling, had vanished in the flames. It was the work of a lifetime, a library of scholarship that existed nowhere else on earth, utterly destroyed. William Carey was in Calcutta when the fire broke out. He made the journey home to Serampore, to a scene of silent, grieving friends and the smoldering ruins of his work. He walked through the wreckage, his face etched with a deep and profound sorrow. The physical evidence of his life's labor was gone. It was a moment that could have shattered the faith of any man. But as his friends watched, they saw in him not the despair of a broken man, but the quiet, resilient strength of a man whose hope was anchored in something far beyond the visible world. His grief was real and deep, but it was not the grief of one who has lost everything. Later, he would write of that moment, his words a timeless testament to a faith refined by fire. "The Lord has laid me low," he wrote, "that I may look more simply to Him. In one short evening, the labors of years are consumed. How unsearchable are the ways of God! We are cast down, but not in despair." He saw the hand of a sovereign God, not in an act of punishment, but in an act of profound and painful mercy. He believed that God had allowed this to happen to strip them of any pride they may have had in their own accomplishments, to teach them to depend not on their printing press or their books, but on God alone. This quiet, unshakable faith became the anchor for the entire community. On the following Sunday, they gathered for worship, not in their usual place, but in the open air, with the ruins of the print shop before them. They sang hymns of praise to the God who gives and the God who takes away. Their faith had not been consumed by the flames. It had been purified by them. News of the fire, however, had to be sent to their supporters in England. William Ward wrote a long and detailed letter to their friend Andrew Fuller, listing the devastating losses, but he ended his letter not with a plea for pity, but with a declaration of faith, echoing Carey's own sentiment. When this letter arrived in England weeks later, it was read aloud at a committee meeting. The news was met not with groans of despair, but with a spirit of determined resolve. The story of the great fire at Serampore and the even greater faith of the missionaries captured the heart of the Christian public. A great wave of compassion and generosity swept across the nation. Churches and individuals from every denomination began to give. The story was told in pulpits, and special offerings were collected. It was a remarkable and spontaneous outpouring of support. In just 50 days, the entire financial loss of the fire was covered, and the fund continued to grow. It was a powerful and visible expression of the unity of the body of Christ, a global family rising up to hold the ropes for their brothers on the other side of the world. Back in Serampore, this news was received with overwhelming gratitude. The work of rebuilding began at once. With the new, generous funds, they were able to purchase a larger, more modern printing press, far superior to the one they had lost. The print shop was rebuilt, bigger and more efficient than before. And William Carey, with his incredible, God-given intellect and his disciplined notes, sat down at his desk and began the painstaking task of rewriting his life's work from memory. What the enemy had intended for utter destruction, God was already turning into a story of restoration and expansion. The mission at Serampore rose from the ashes, stronger and better equipped than before. Their work was now supported by a broader and more passionate base of prayer and financial gifts from around the world. The fire had burned away the wood, the hay, and the stubble, but the foundation of faith, built on the rock of God's sovereignty, remained unshaken. The great work of the mission had been tested by a literal fire and found to be true. But even as the buildings were being restored, William Carey's own heart was about to enter a new and different kind of crucible, a series of quiet, personal losses that would test his faith not in a single, dramatic night, but in the slow, silent grief of the passing years. Chapter 13, The Weight of Grief, the Gift of Love. A life of great and noble purpose is not a life that is free from great and personal sorrow. The same heart that can hold a vision for the entire world must also bear the quiet, particular pains of its own journey. But in the midst of loss, in the seasons of long and silent grieving, God often provides the unexpected and tender gift of companionship and peace. The great fire had tested the mission's collective faith, and that faith had emerged from the flames stronger and more refined. But the most difficult trials in William Carey's life were not always these sudden public catastrophes. They were the slow, quiet, and unseen battles fought within the walls of his own home. For many years, alongside the monumental work of translation and the demanding duties of his professorship, he had carried a heavy and constant burden of grief. His first wife, Dorothy, the young woman who had so reluctantly followed him from the familiar comforts of England, had never found her footing in the strange new world of India. The accumulation of culture shock, the loss of her beloved son, Peter, and the profound isolation had overwhelmed her spirit, leading her into a deep and bewildering mental illness from which she would never recover. For years, William was not only a missionary and a scholar, but a patient and long-suffering caregiver. He tended to her needs in the midst of her profound confusion, a quiet and daily act of faithfulness in a situation that offered no hope of earthly improvement. It was a long winter of the soul, a hidden sorrow that he bore with a quiet reliance on God's grace. In the year 1807, her long trial finally came to an end. She passed away, and her troubled mind was at last at peace. For William, it was a moment of deep and complex sadness, a final closing of a chapter that had held both the youthful love of their early years and the immense strain of their time in India. He grieved for the woman she had been and for the partner he had lost so long ago to the fog of her illness. He was now alone, a widower, carrying the full weight of his work and his family. In the quiet of his study, surrounded by his books and manuscripts, the silence must have been profound. But God in his tender mercy, did not intend for his servant to walk the rest of his path alone. He was about to provide a gift of grace, a companion who would bring a new season of light and joy into his life. Her name was Charlotte Rumor. She was a Danish noblewoman, a woman of deep piety and a brilliant, cultivated mind who had come to live in Serampore. In every way, she was different from Dorothy. She was well educated, fluent in several languages, and shared a deep and scholarly passion for the things of God. She had been drawn to the simple, earnest faith of the Serampore Church and had become a devoted member of the community. A deep and respectful friendship grew between the widowed professor and the devout Danish lady. They found in each other a kinship of both mind and spirit. And in the year 1808, just a year after Dorothy's passing, William Carey and Charlotte Rumor were married. This union was a profound and unexpected blessing, a gentle sunrise after a long and sorrowful night. In Charlotte, William found not just a wife, but a true partner in every sense of the word. She was his intellectual equal, a companion who could engage with the complexities of his translation work, who shared his love for literature, and who delighted in his passion for the botanical garden. She learned the classical language of Sanskrit so that she could better understand his scholarly pursuits. She brought a sense of order, peace, and refined beauty into his home, creating a sanctuary of quiet happiness that had been absent for so many years. She was a loving stepmother to his children and a gracious hostess to the constant stream of visitors at the mission. The 13 years of marriage were by all accounts a time of deep and abiding joy for William. The constant strain of his previous domestic life was lifted, and in this new atmosphere of peace and mutual support, his own immense gifts were free to flourish as never before. The weight of loneliness was replaced by the warmth of a shared life. The silence of his study now filled with the quiet companionship of a kindred spirit. Their home was a picture of a godly and loving partnership, a testament to God's ability to bring restoration and unexpected joy into the most broken of stories. But the seasons of life continue to turn, and this beautiful summer of companionship was not to last forever. After 13 happy years, Charlotte fell gravely ill. William nursed her with tender devotion, but her health declined, and she eventually passed away. This time, however, the grief was different. It was not the ragged, complicated sorrow of his first loss, but the deep, clean pain of losing a beloved and cherished friend. He mourned her deeply, but his grief was mingled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the 13 years of happiness God had given them. He had learned to grieve with a sure and certain hope, his heart anchored in the goodness of a God who had so graciously provided for him. Even now, God's tender care was not finished. He did not intend for William to face his final years in solitude. A few years later, he married for a third time. His bride was Grace Hughes, a widow who had been a dear friend and a faithful member of the Serampore community for many years. Theirs was not the passionate, intellectual partnership he had shared with Charlotte, but a quiet, comfortable, and loving companionship for the final chapter of their lives. Grace was a woman of gentle strength and deep faith, and she became his devoted caregiver as his own health began to fail in his old age. It was another act of God's practical and loving provision, a final gift of human comfort for the last stage of the journey. Through the deep valleys of sorrow and on the sunlit uplands of joy, William Carey had found God to be utterly faithful. He had known the long ache of a lonely and difficult marriage, and he had known the profound blessing of a true and happy union. He had learned to receive both with a heart of quiet submission and deep gratitude. His personal life was now settled in a state of peaceful grace. He was a man who had been well loved, a man who had found rest for his heart. And with this quiet strength supporting him, he could turn his full attention to the great work that still lay before him, to see the final fulfillment of the moral and spiritual battles he had been waging for a lifetime. Chapter 14, the final word. As the sun sets on a long and fruitful day, a laborer can look back over the fields, not to admire the work of his own hands, but to give thanks for the faithfulness of the Master who gave him the strength for the harvest. For William Carey, the evening of his life was drawing in, a time of quiet reflection on a lifetime of labor and a peaceful preparation for his journey home. The long, patient, and often discouraging battle that he had waged for the rights of widows was about to reach its victorious conclusion. In the year 1829, a new Governor-General arrived in India. His name was Lord William Bentinck, and he was a man of firm conviction and moral courage. He was not content to follow the old policy of non-interference in the face of what he knew to be a profound injustice. He had read Carey's reports, he had studied his arguments, and his own conscience had been stirred. He resolved to do what his predecessors had failed to do. He would abolish the practice of sati. On a quiet December day, the law was passed. The act of widow burning was now illegal, a criminal offense. When the news was brought to Serampore, William Carey was an old man, frail and recovering from a recent illness. His response was not one of loud and public celebration, but of deep, quiet, and overwhelming gratitude. The prayers of decades had been answered. The long, unseen battle had been won. In a beautiful and fitting final act, the government asked Professor Carey, as the foremost scholar of the Bengali language, to perform the official translation of the new law. The man who had first raised his voice against the horror of the funeral pyres now had the profound and quiet satisfaction of translating the very words that would extinguish them forever. It was the final word in a long and righteous struggle. His own final chapter was now being written. His body, which had carried him through so many decades of relentless labor, was growing weary. He retired from his post at the college and spent his final years in the peaceful sanctuary of the Serampore mission, the community he had co-founded and loved so dearly. His days fell into a gentle, quiet rhythm. He was surrounded by his loving wife, Grace, his children, his grandchildren, and the dear friends who had been his partners in the great work for so long. Visitors from all over the world would make the pilgrimage to Serampore to meet the legendary figure who was now known as the father of modern missions. They would arrive expecting to find a great man, a spiritual giant, but instead they would find a humble, gentle soul sitting in his garden, his eyes still filled with the quiet wonder at the beauty of a flower. He was always more eager to talk about the glories of his Savior than about any of his own accomplishments. His mind remained as sharp and as active as ever. Unable to do the more strenuous work of his youth, he dedicated his final years to one last great labor of love. He undertook a complete and final revision of his beloved Bengali Bible translation. Propped up with pillows in his chair, he would spend hours each day carefully reviewing every single word, every phrase, seeking to make it as clear, as accurate, and as beautiful as it could possibly be. It was the work of a faithful steward tending to his most precious treasure until the very end. He wanted to ensure that the light he was passing on to the next generation was as pure and as bright as he could make it. As he felt his time on earth drawing to a close, he began to make his final preparations. He was a man at peace, not with a sense of grim resignation, but with a quiet and joyful anticipation. He had fought the good fight. He had finished the race. He had kept the faith. And now he was simply waiting to go home. One day, he called his friends to his side to give them instructions for his burial. He asked for no great monument, no grand eulogy. His requests were for a service of simple dignity. But there was one instruction that he gave with a particular and earnest emphasis. It concerned the inscription to be placed upon his simple gravestone. He asked that it record only his name, the dates of his birth and death, and then, beneath them, a single line from a hymn written by Isaac Watts. This one line was to be his final word, his ultimate confession of faith, the summary of his entire life. The line he chose was this: "A wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall." These are words that can be easily misunderstood in our modern age. They can sound like the words of a man with no self-esteem, a statement of morbid self-deprecation. But for William Carey, they were the most profound and glorious truth in the universe. This was not the statement of a man who saw no value in himself. It was the statement of a man who saw the infinite, immeasurable value of the grace of God. After a lifetime of monumental achievements that had reshaped a nation, after translating the Bible into dozens of languages, founding a college, leading a global mission, and changing the laws of a land, this was the one thing he wanted the world to remember about him. He was not a hero. He was not a saint. He was not a spiritual giant. He was a helpless sinner, saved and sustained every moment of his life by a grace he had done nothing to deserve. His final word was not to be about his great attempt for God, but about his complete and utter dependence on the kindness of God. His life's work was not a ladder he had built to heaven, but a testament to a Savior who had come down to him. It was the ultimate expression of his humility, the final, perfect distillation of his faith. In the early morning hours of June the 9th, in the year 1834, at the age of 72, William Carey peacefully breathed his last. He was surrounded by those he loved, his long life of labor finally over. The faithful servant had been called into the joy of his master. The great work was finished. The final word had been spoken. His simple gravestone stands in the mission cemetery at Serampore to this day. Its humble inscription points away from the man who lies beneath it and points instead to the everlasting arms of the Savior who had caught him when he fell. His life on earth was over, but a true legacy of that life, a work built not of stone, but of faith and love, was only just beginning to unfold across the world. Chapter 15. A work that endures. Some people build their legacy with stone and mortar, creating monuments that stand for a time before crumbling into dust. Others build with faith and with love, planting seeds that grow into a living legacy, a forest of hope that continues to spread long after the planter has been laid to rest. The work of William Carey was not a monument that would fade with time. It was a living work that endures. When William Carey passed away in his 73rd year, his death was not marked by any grand ceremony of the British Empire. In the great, powerful city of Calcutta, the news of the passing of an old missionary in the small town of Serampore was a quiet and minor event. But the work that God had begun through this one humble man was like a great and silent river, a current of grace that had already begun to reshape the spiritual landscape of a nation, and its flow would not be stopped by the passing of a single life. The true measure of his legacy is not found in any one achievement, but in the many streams of living water that flowed from his one surrendered life. His first and greatest legacy was the Word, made plain. He was, above all else, a translator. His life's great passion was to remove the veil of language so that every person could have the priceless gift of reading God's story in their own tongue. The sheer scale of what he and his team accomplished is a testament to a lifetime of patient, scholarly devotion. Through their efforts, the Bible, in whole or in part, was made available in over 40 different languages and dialects. For millions upon millions of people, from the mountains of the north to the coasts of the south, the voice of God was no longer a distant echo in a foreign tongue, but a clear and personal word, speaking directly to the heart. This was the foundation upon which everything else was built. From this foundation grew a legacy of the mind. William Carey was a passionate educator. He believed that faith and reason were partners, and that to love God was to love Him with all of one's mind. The schools he helped to establish at Serampore, for both boys and girls, were a radical act of hope, opening a world of literacy and opportunity to those who had been denied it. This work culminated in the founding of Serampore College, the first institution of higher learning of its kind in Asia. He envisioned it as a place where the knowledge of the East and the West could meet, a center for learning where Christian values would shape the minds and characters of India's future leaders. He also left behind a legacy in the land itself. His love for God's creation was not a passive appreciation, it was an active and fruitful stewardship. The agri-horticultural society he founded continued to flourish, promoting a scientific and sustainable approach to agriculture that improved the lives of countless ordinary people. His work was a quiet testament to a holistic gospel, a faith that cared for the soil as well as the soul, that sought to bring nourishment and abundance to the physical lives of the people he loved. And he left a legacy of the heart, a legacy of justice and compassion. His long and tireless campaign against the practice of sati was a monumental victory for the dignity of women. He used his voice to speak for those who had no voice, his influence to defend the most vulnerable. His life was a powerful example of the truth that a love for God must always result in a love for one's neighbor, a love that actively seeks to relieve suffering and correct oppression. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of all was not in what he did, but in what he inspired. In a sermon long ago, trying to explain the partnership between the missionaries in the field and their supporters back home, he'd used a simple and powerful analogy. He compared himself to a miner being lowered on a rope into a deep and dangerous mine to excavate for jewels. "I will go down into the pit," he'd said, "if you will hold the rope." This image became the defining metaphor for his life's work. He saw himself as the one on the front lines, but he knew with every fiber of his being that he was utterly dependent on the faithful prayers and support of those who were holding the rope for him. When William Carey died, the rope did not fall. It was simply passed into other hands. An entire generation had been watching his example. They had heard his simple, powerful call: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And they were inspired. His life ignited a global missionary movement that would mark the entire 19th century. Young men and women from Europe and America, their hearts set on fire by his story, would leave their homes and follow the path he had cleared to India, to Africa, to China, and to the islands of the sea. They all, in their own way, picked up the rope he had left behind. The story of William Carey is not, in the end, the story of a great man. It is the story of a great and wonderful God who delights in using the most humble and unlikely of instruments to accomplish his glorious purposes. It is the story of a poor shoemaker from a small English village, a boy with a curious mind and a willing heart who simply made himself available to God. He took the 5 loaves and 2 small fish of his own life, his gift for languages and his patient spirit, and he placed them in the hands of the master. And in the master's hands, that humble offering was multiplied, and it fed a nation. His life is a quiet and peaceful invitation to each one of us. It is a reminder that God does not require our strength or our brilliance, but only our willingness. It is a call to a life of quiet faithfulness, a life that expects great and wonderful things from a God who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine. And so, as our story comes to a close, may the peace of God settle upon you. May you find rest in the knowledge that the same kind and gracious arms that William Carey fell into at the end of his long life are open to you tonight. And may you rest secure in the love of the great God who holds the whole world and you in his hands. And so, the story of William Carey comes to its peaceful close. The final word has been spoken, a testament not to the greatness of a man, but to the unending grace of a great and loving God. We leave him there, resting in the quiet soil of Serampore, under the shade of the trees he so loved, his life's long labor complete. His story, like a gentle and slowly flowing river, has now passed by us, and we are left on the quiet bank, in the stillness of this present moment. The echoes of his life, the lessons of his journey, now settle around us like a soft and comforting blanket, inviting us not to action, but to a deep and profound rest. Let the details of his life now begin to fade, like the colors of a sunset blending into the soft gray of twilight. What remains is not the memory of dates or of names, but the gentle spirit that animated his journey. It is this spirit of quiet faith, of patient endurance, and of peaceful surrender that we can now invite into our own hearts as we prepare for sleep. Think for a moment of the very beginning of his story. See in your mind's eye that small, quiet workshop in the English countryside, the smell of leather in the air, the simple tools on the bench, the focused, humble work of a young man mending shoes. It was in that small, unseen place that a great and global vision was born. God did not plant this world-changing dream in the heart of a king in his castle or a general in his war room, but in the heart of a poor cobbler in his quiet workshop. Let this truth bring a deep and settled peace to your own soul tonight. Your own life may feel small, your work may feel hidden, unseen, and unnoticed by the wider world. You may have your own quiet workshop, your own kitchen, your own office, your own simple and repetitive daily tasks. And you may wonder if any of it truly matters. The life of William Carey is a gentle whisper from the past, assuring you that it does. God delights in small, humble beginnings. He sees the faithfulness in the quiet places. He honors the prayers that are whispered when no one else is listening. You do not need a grand stage or a loud voice to be a part of His great and beautiful work. Your simple, steady faithfulness in the small corners of your life is a fragrant offering to Him. So tonight, release the burden of feeling that you must do more, be more, or achieve more. Release the pressure to be seen, to be recognized, or to be important. You can rest right now in the peaceful knowledge that the God who saw the cobbler at his bench also sees you right where you are. And His greatest works are often born in the quietest of rooms. Now, let your mind drift to those long and difficult years in the wilderness. Remember those 7 years of labor with no visible fruit, no converts, no sign of success. 7 years of pouring His heart out onto dry and barren ground. It is a story that resonates with a deep and often unspoken part of our own souls. We have all known our own wilderness seasons. We've all labored in a field that has yielded no harvest. We've prayed prayers that have seemed to go unanswered. We've invested our love in relationships that have not flourished. We've worked diligently at tasks that have not succeeded. And in those long dry seasons, it is so easy to become discouraged, to believe that our efforts are in vain. But the lesson from that lonely indigo factory is one of profound and liberating peace. William Carey's faithfulness was not dependent on his results. His obedience was not conditional on success. He continued to sow the seed of the word, not because he saw the sprouts, but because he trusted the goodness of the sower. And so, tonight, you can give yourself permission to rest from the exhausting work of measuring your own success. You can release the need to see the immediate fruit of your labor. Your calling is not to create the harvest, it is simply to be faithful in the sowing. You can lay down the heavy burden of results and find your rest in the simple act of obedience. God does not ask you to be successful. He only asks you to be faithful. And your faithfulness today, in this season, is enough. It is more than enough. Let that truth wash over you like a gentle, healing rain, and let your tired heart be still. Consider now the beautiful, quiet rhythm of the garden. See the orderly rows, the vibrant blossoms, the patient, hopeful work of the gardener. William Carey's love for the soil was a reflection of his trust in the God of seasons. He knew that one cannot force a seed to grow. One can only prepare the soil, plant the seed, water it, and then wait in patient trust for the miracle of life to unfold in its own time. Your own life is a garden tended by a master gardener who knows the perfect timing for all things. There are seasons for planting, seasons for watering, seasons for quiet, unseen growth beneath the surface, and seasons for harvest. You do not need to live in all of those seasons at once. If you are in a season of planting, of new beginnings and hard work, you can do so without anxiety for the future harvest. If you are in a season of waiting, when all seems dormant and still, you can rest in the knowledge that deep beneath the surface, roots are growing and life is being prepared. And if you are in a season of harvest, of joy and abundance, you can receive it with a grateful heart. Release the urge to rush the seasons of your life. Release the anxiety that you are behind or that the winter will last forever. You are in the hands of a wise and loving gardener who makes all things beautiful in His time. You can trust His timing. You can rest in this season right now, knowing that it is exactly where you're meant to be. And finally, let your mind come to rest on that one simple line, the final word He chose for Himself. A wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall. Let the profound peace of that thought settle over you now. Imagine the freedom of it. It is the freedom of a child who, after a long and tiring day of trying to build their own castles in the sand, finally lets go and allows themselves to be lifted into the strong and loving arms of a parent. All their striving is over. All their efforts to prove themselves are done. All that is left is to be held. This is the ultimate invitation into sleep. It is the release of every burden, every pretense, every fear. You do not have to hold yourself together tonight. You do not have to be strong. You do not have to have all the answers. You do not have to carry the weight of your own life, your own sorrows, your own failures. You are invited right now to do the one thing that William Carey pointed to at the end of his long and accomplished life. You are invited to simply fall, to let go of your grip on the day, to release your hold on all your worries and all your plans, and to allow yourself to fall gently, peacefully, and completely into the kind, safe, and everlasting arms of a God who loves you. He is strong enough to hold you. He is gracious enough to catch you. And in His embrace, you will find a rest that is deeper and more secure than any you could ever create for yourself. So now, let this be a time of falling. Let your body fall into a state of deep and complete relaxation. Feel the weight of your head on the pillow and let it go. Feel the tension in your jaw and let it fall away. Feel the weight of your shoulders and let them sink down, released from all their burdens. Let a wave of peace fall from the top of your head, down through your neck and your back, down through your arms and your hands, down through your legs and your feet. Every muscle, every fiber of your being, letting go, falling into rest, and let your mind fall into a state of quiet trust. Let the busy thoughts of the day fall away like leaves from a tree in autumn. Let the worries about tomorrow fall away. Let the regrets of yesterday fall away. Your only work now is to rest. Your only task is to be still, to be held, to fall into the deep, quiet, and peaceful ocean of sleep. The story is over. The day is done. The night is a gift of grace, a quiet cathedral for the soul to find its rest in God. Let the rhythm of your own breathing be a gentle lullaby, breathing in the peace of God, breathing out all that is troubled, breathing in His faithfulness, breathing out your fears. You are safe, you are held, you are loved, and all is well. May the Lord bless you and keep you as you sleep. May His face shine upon you and be gracious to you, and may He give you a peace that passes all understanding, a deep, restorative, and healing sleep until you wake to the light of a new day, filled with His mercy. If this story and this time of rest has been a gift to you, we quietly invite you to share this peace with others who might be searching for it. And to continue these nights of calm reflection with us, you are always welcome to subscribe. But for now, all of that can wait. The world can wait. All that is left for you to do is to rest. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep in peace. Amen.